We were all taught as children to be afraid of strangers. In our imagination, this is usually some creepy, lonely figure in dark clothes, waiting in the shadows. We are told not to take candy, not to get into a car with a strange man. But what if evil doesn't look like that at all? What if it has the face of an ordinary married couple? A smiling woman in the passenger seat waving to you and offering a ride. In such a situation, any child would be confused. After all, this isn't a scary man. These are auntie and uncle. They are together. They seem safe. It was into this trap that 8-year-old Sofia Nowak fell on July 6th, 2022. That day, everything began with an ordinary childish resentment. Sofia lived with her mother in Gdansk, and as happens with all children, they had a quarrel. One word led to another, emotions took over, and Sofia, slamming the door, decided to run away. But not just anywhere, but with a specific goal. In the neighboring city of Sopot, just 20 to 30 minutes away by car, lived her best friends. In her childish mind, this was a perfect plan. She would reach them, and everyone would see how much she had been hurt. She packed a small backpack, putting in a bottle of water and her favorite teddy bear, everything needed for a big journey. She didn't think about real danger. She thought about adventure and about making up with her mother when she returned. Leaving the house, she headed on foot along the highway leading from Gdansk to Sopot. A highway during the day is a bustling place. Hundreds of cars rush by, the sun shines, and there is the usual daytime hustle and bustle. It would seem like the safest place in the world. And then, on the side of this road, a small figure with a backpack on her back is noticed from an old white van. Marek Kowalski was driving, and next to him was his wife, Ewa. To Sofia, they looked like salvation, an ordinary couple who are perhaps also going to Sopot. The car stops, the window rolls down, and the woman with a kind smile asks if she needs a ride. Sofia, tired and upset, sees not a threat, but help. She says she is going to her friends, and Ewa joyfully replies that they are going in the same direction. This moment became the point of no return. Sofia got into the car, confident that her little adventure was about to become much easier. She didn't yet know that it had already ended. The slammed door of the old van cut Sofia off from the entire world she knew. From the noise of the busy highway, from the sunlight, from the possibility of simply changing her mind and running back home. Inside, in the dim light, it smelled of gasoline and something sweet, cloying. But to her, it was just the interior of a car, in which kind adults were sitting, promising to help. She didn't yet know that her little journey, her childish rebellion, had ended the moment she accepted that offer. To understand how she ended up alone on that highway at all, one must go back several hours, to their apartment with her mother in Gdansk, and look at the world through the eyes of an 8-year-old child. Who was Sofia Nowak? If you look at her photographs, you will see an ordinary girl with light hair and a slightly mischievous smile. She was not quiet, but she was not a bully either. As her mother later told investigators, Sofia was a child with character. She loved to draw, and whole stacks of albums were filled with drawings of princesses, dragons, and magical castles. She was a very loyal friend. If someone hurt her friends in the yard, Sofia was the first to rush to their defense. And she was also stubborn. If an idea came into her head, it was almost impossible to dissuade her. She lived alone with her mother, Anna, in a small but cozy apartment in one of the residential areas of Gdansk, an ordinary life. In the morning, her mother would take her to school. After lessons, Sofia would go to an art club, and evenings they spent together having dinner and watching cartoons. Anna worked 2 jobs to ensure her daughter had everything she needed, and of course, she was tired. But she loved her child immensely. And so, On that day, July 6th, an argument broke out. You know, it wasn't some terrible family drama, the kind they write about in newspapers. It was a ridiculously mundane, everyday conflict, the kind that happens in every other family. The bone of contention, a tablet. Sofia wanted to play, and her mother said she had already spent the whole morning with it. One word led to another, and soon voices were raised. Anna, tired after a difficult week, was adamant. Sofia, feeling a universal injustice, shouted something hurtful. In response, her mother said that if that was the case, she wouldn't see the tablet until the end of summer. For an adult, it's just a disciplinary measure. But for an 8-year-old child, whose world is still so small and black and white, it was a catastrophe, a tragedy, a betrayal, a thought, which seems so logical at that age, flashed through her mind. They don't love me here. If that's the case, I'll go where I am loved and understood. And that place, of course, was the home of her best friends in Sopot. In a child's mind, it wasn't just a neighboring city. It was almost a fairy tale land, where it was always fun, where she was awaited, and where she would definitely be allowed to play on the tablet as much as she wanted. The distance of 12 kilometers didn't scare her. In her imagination, it was an exciting adventure. Like in the books she read with her mom before bed, she quietly went to her room, took her school backpack, put in the most important passenger, a teddy bear named Toby, a bottle of water, and a couple of apples. A real hiking kit. She put on her favorite glitter sneakers and, trying not to make a sound, slipped out the door. Her mother was in the kitchen at the time and didn't even hear the lock click. She was sure that her daughter, as usual, was sulking in her room and would come out to make up in half an hour. But Sofia was already walking down the street, full of determination and childish resentment towards her fate. She didn't look back. She walked forward to Sopot, to her imaginary safe haven. And she didn't even suspect that every step she took only led her further from safety and straight into a trap set on the side of a very ordinary road. And while Sofia was taking her last steps in freedom, approaching that white van, time in her apartment in Gdansk flowed quite differently. Her mother, Anna, still suspected nothing. At first, she was sure that her daughter was just sitting in her room, sulking. An hour passed, then another. Anna approached the door several times, listening. Silence. At some point, she decided that enough was enough. It was time to make up. She knocked, opened the door, and saw something that made her heart skip a beat. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made. Pencils lay on the table, and Sofia herself was nowhere to be found. The first thought, maybe she's hiding. Anna checked the closet, looked under the bed. Empty. And it was then, in the silence of that empty children's room, that ordinary maternal annoyance slowly began to turn into a sticky, cold fear. First, there was a stage of denial. Anna started calling Sofia's friends, the parents of her classmates, even distant relatives. She tried to speak calmly, asking if her daughter had visited them. The answer everywhere was the same. No, we haven't seen her. With each such no, her voice trembled more and more. She ran around the entire yard, looked in the playground, interviewed neighbors. No one had seen anything. The sun was already setting, and the city began to turn orange. For Anna, this beautiful sunset was a harbinger of approaching darkness. Panic was building, and she realized she couldn't handle it alone anymore. In the evening of July 6th, when her daughter had been missing for several hours, Anna Nowak dialed the police. It was with this call that the story of a runaway girl turned into an official missing person case. The police reacted quickly. The first patrol cars arrived at Anna's house, and the standard protocol began. Officers interviewed the grief-stricken mother. recorded Sofia's distinguishing features: light hair, blue eyes, a pink t-shirt, jeans, and those glitter sneakers. Special attention was paid to the small backpack with Toby the bear. The description was immediately sent to all patrols in the city. Police began to comb the area, interviewing neighbors more officially. And quite soon, witnesses were found. Several people confirmed seeing a girl matching the description, walking alone along the highway in the direction of Sopot. This information, on the one hand, gave hope. Now it was clear where she was going. But on the other hand, it also scared her to death. It's one thing when a child is hiding somewhere in a neighboring yard, and quite another when they are walking alone on a busy highway. The search perimeter immediately expanded to tens of square kilometers. But time had been lost. With the onset of darkness, Sofia's trail completely disappeared. Patrols, slowly driving along the highway with their searchlights on, found nothing. It was as if she had been erased from the roadside. It became clear this was not a case where a child would return home for dinner. A full-scale, large-scale operation with volunteers and dog handlers could only be launched in the morning. And for now, the mother had only one thing left to do: sit by the window, look into the darkness, and pray. But no one that night yet knew that they should no longer be looking for a living girl. That terrible night for Anna Nowak dragged on endlessly, but eventually morning came. A morning that brought no relief, but only the beginning of a new spiral of nightmare. With the first rays of the sun, a large-scale search operation began. Dozens of police officers, dog handlers with dogs, and hundreds of caring volunteers scoured every meter of the forest, fields, and roadsides between Gdansk and Sopot. Sofia's photograph was already everywhere. But all these searches, all this hope, were already meaningless. Because 4 days later, on July the 10th, a mushroom picker in the forest made that very terrible discovery. And from that moment, the focus of the investigation sharply shifted. Now they were not looking for a missing girl. Now they were looking for the one who ended her life. The investigation team split into two main directions. The first team, forensic experts, worked at the scene where the body was found. This was slow, painstaking work. They literally sifted the earth, collecting everything that could be evidence: fabric fibers, cigarette butts, tire tracks on the nearest dirt road. But the forest is the worst place to collect evidence. Rain, wind, wild animals, all this destroys traces. And in this case, nature, it seemed, was on the side of the criminal. After several days of careful examination, the conclusion was disappointing. No direct evidence that could point to the identity of the person who brought Sofia here was found. No fingerprints, no DNA traces, nothing. The place where her life ended remained silent. Therefore, all hope was placed on the second team, the detectives who tried to reconstruct Sofia's last day. The starting point was the Gdansk-Sopot highway. It was here that she was last seen alive. In the 21st century, the first thing that comes to mind in such a situation is surveillance cameras. There should be many of them on such a busy highway. For investigators, this was the most obvious and simple path. Request recordings from all cameras for July the 6th, review hours of video, and find the car that stopped next to the little girl. This would be almost 100% success. They sent official requests and waited. The answer that came a few hours later was like a punch to the gut. Most of the cameras on that section of the highway simply did not work that day. Some were undergoing scheduled maintenance. Some broke down. On some, software updates were underway. Banal bureaucratic negligence and technical failures turned the main evidence into nothing. The digital trail that could have led to the criminal was cut short before it even began. The police were at a dead end. They had a body, but no evidence. They had a crime scene, but no witnesses. They had a starting point, the highway, but no way to track it. And then they took a step that often becomes the last hope in such cases. They appealed to the public. On all TV channels, news websites, and social media, an official appeal from the Gdansk police appeared. They asked all drivers who were driving on the Gdansk-Sopot highway on July the 6th, between lunch and evening, to check the recordings from their car video recorders. This was a desperate attempt. The chance that the right moment was captured on someone's recorder and that this person would see the appeal and respond was infinitesimally small. But it was the only chance they had left. Now the fate of the entire investigation depended not on the professionalism of the police, but on chance and the conscientiousness of ordinary citizens. This police appeal for help was like a message in a bottle thrown into dark water. No one knew if it would reach anyone or if it would be read. But in the modern world, such a bottle floats not on water, but through the information streams of social networks, and the reaction followed almost instantly. But it was not at all what the investigators expected. Instead of quietly reviewing recorder footage, the internet decided to find the culprit itself, and as often happens, it found him quickly, furiously, and completely mistakenly. It all started with one comment under a post about finding witnesses. Someone wrote that they allegedly saw a girl resembling Sofia on that day, July the 6th, talking to some man near the highway. This comment, unsupported by any evidence, became the spark. Then, the snowball effect worked. Dozens and then hundreds of people began to demand details. Someone remembered that a strange man lived in that area. He has long hair, tattoos, and he often walks alone. This was enough. A few hours later, his photos, taken from an old social media page, were already circulating in local public groups. An hour later, someone published his name, surname, and even address. The internet court delivered its verdict without an investigation and without the right to defense. Curses were written under his photos. He was threatened with violence. People, convinced of their righteousness, demanded that the police immediately arrest that bastard. For the police, this situation was a nightmare. On the one hand, they could not ignore such public resonance. Any lead, even the most dubious, had to be followed up. On the other hand, they perfectly understood that they were dealing with a classic witch hunt. Detectives established the identity of this man and came to his home. He was an ordinary guy, an IT specialist who worked remotely and indeed looked a little informal. He was in shock. He had no idea that the whole country had considered him a monster for several hours already. During the interrogation, he behaved calmly and told them where he was on July 6th. That day, he was home all day, working on an urgent project. And in the evening, friends came to him to celebrate his birthday. He named the names and phone numbers of 5 people. While one group of detectives checked his words, another studied his digital life, online activity, geolocation data from his phone. Everything matched. His alibi was ironclad. Friends confirmed that they were at his place from evening until late night. Data from his computer showed that he was indeed online and working all day. There was not a single chance that he could have been tens of kilometers from his home on the Gdansk-Sopot highway. Several hours later, the police released an official statement that clearly and unequivocally said, "This man has nothing to do with the case." But for him, this hell did not end so easily. He still had to prove his innocence to acquaintances for a long time and catch sidelong glances on the street. And for the investigation, it was a step backward. Precious time was spent checking a false lead born of panic and speculation. The investigation returned to square one. They still had nothing but a ghostly hope that somewhere on someone's dashcam flash drive, the key to the puzzle was still recorded. And then, when it seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end and public anger, poured out on an innocent person, only complicated everything. One phone call rang out. The very one that the investigators had been waiting for, almost losing hope. A man, a truck driver, who on July 6 was making a trip on the Gdansk-Sopot highway, responded to the police's call. He said he heard the appeal on the radio, and although he did not remember seeing anything unusual, he still decided to check the recording from his dash cam, just in case. He rewound to the right date, to the right time, and at first noticed nothing, just an endless ribbon of road. But then, at some point, his gaze caught a small figure on the roadside. He zoomed in on the image and saw her, a girl in a pink t-shirt with a backpack on her back. And a few seconds later, he also drove into the frame. A white van. For the investigative team, this was a bomb. In complete silence, in a dark meeting room, detectives looked at the screen on which the last moments of Zofia Nowak's freedom were playing. Here she walks along the roadside, small and determined. Here our witness's car overtakes her, and here, from behind, an unremarkable white van appears and slowly catches up with her. It was not driving fast. It seemed to be targeting her. Then the van pulled alongside her and smoothly braked. The recording lasted only a few seconds, and the actual boarding of the car was not visible on it. The witness's dashcam only recorded the moment of the stop. But that was enough. This was the missing link, the very key they had been looking for. The euphoria in the room was almost palpable. Finally, they had a real, tangible lead. But this euphoria did not last long, exactly until they tried to enlarge the image to see the license plate. And here they were met with cruel disappointment. The recording was made in motion, in the middle of the day. Sunlight reflected off the rear door of the van, creating glare. The quality of the dashcam itself was far from perfect. The license plate turned into a blurry white spot with several unreadable dark dots. The best forensic experts sat for hours over these few frames. They applied all possible filters, used the most modern image enhancement programs, and tried to restore the number pixel by pixel. All was in vain. Technology proved powerless. They had the most important clue in the case in their hands, which at the same time was absolutely useless. They saw the criminal's car but could not identify it. This was the moment of truth for the entire investigation. Yes, they did not know the number. They couldn't even confidently determine the exact make and model of the van. It was too generic on the recording without any distinguishing features. But now they had the main thing: a target. The task was no longer abstract. Now it sounded like this: find a white van in and around the Pomeranian voivodeship that was on the Gdansk-Sopot highway on July 6th. It still felt like searching for a needle in a haystack, but at least now they knew exactly that they were looking for a needle, not just sifting through hay. The alert for a white van of unknown make went out to all police stations in the country. A total check of all similar vehicles began. Delivery services, construction companies, private owners. It was a titanic job, but they had no other choice. Somewhere in this stream of white vans was hidden the one that took Sofia on her last journey. This titanic work of checking all white vans was hell for the police. Imagine, hundreds, if not thousands, of vehicles across the region. Detectives and patrol officers worked around the clock, methodically going through lists compiled from databases. They checked everything, from vans of large logistics companies to old work vehicles belonging to private craftsmen. Most checks ended in nothing. Drivers provided alibis, showed waybills, and were crossed off the list. It was an exhausting, routine job where hope dwindled with each passing day. But it is in such a routine, when one's eyes are already glazed over, that sometimes something slips through that makes one perk up. And this happened when it was the turn of an unremarkable van registered to a married couple from the Gdansk suburbs, Marek and Ewa Kowalski. At first glance, they were an absolutely ordinary family. They lived in a small private house, and neighbors described them as quiet and non-confrontational people. Marek worked for a small construction company. Ewa was a homemaker. When detectives arrived, they were met by a polite, smiling woman. She invited them into the house, offered coffee. Everything was overly normal. Too normal. The detectives asked the standard question they had asked hundreds of times in recent days. Where were you and your husband on July 6th, in the middle of the day? Ewa Kowalska, without batting an eye, replied that they had been home all day. Marek, according to her, was busy with repairs in the garage, and she was busy with household chores. She spoke calmly, confidently, like a person who had nothing to hide. When the detectives asked to speak with her husband, he came out of the garage, wiping his hands with a rag, and fully confirmed her words. Yes, they were home. No, they did not drive onto the highway towards Sopot. Their van stood in the yard all day. It was a simple and clear answer. And if it weren't for one but, this check would most likely have ended there. But something bothered the experienced detective who was handling the case. Some elusive detail in their behavior, an excessive calmness that bordered on rehearsed. He thanked them for their time, and they left. But upon returning to the station, he did not cross them off the list. Instead, he did something that became a turning point in the entire investigation. He submitted a request for billing data from Marek and Ewa Kowalski's mobile phones for July 6th. This is a standard procedure that allows tracking a person's movement by the signals their phone sends to the nearest cell towers. A few hours later, the answer was on his desk, and when he looked at the map that was printed for him, a chill ran down his spine. The Kowalskis' words were a lie, a blatant 100% lie. The billing data from their phones clearly showed that they were not at home during the day on July 6th. Their devices were moving, and they were moving along exactly the same route that Sofia Nowak took, from Gdansk, along the highway towards Sopot. Technology, unlike people, cannot lie. Now the investigation had not just a white van. They had their first real suspects. The map with the billing data lying on the detective's desk was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was a declaration of war. Marek and Ewa Kowalski's lie instantly elevated them from one of hundreds to the status of primary suspects. All the power of the investigative machine, which until then had been dispersed over a vast territory, now focused on a single point, on that quiet house in the suburbs and its owners. They had to act quickly. As long as the Kowalskis did not know their lie was exposed, they had no reason to dispose of evidence. And the main potential piece of evidence, their white van, was still standing in their yard, like a silent witness that could tell everything. That same night, investigators obtained an emergency warrant to search their home and, most importantly, the vehicle. At dawn, not a pair of plainclothes detectives, but an entire convoy of police cars approached the Kowalskis' house. Among them was a special forensic laboratory van. The operation proceeded quietly, without sirens, so as not to attract undue attention. Marek and Ewa were awakened by a polite but firm knock on the door. When they opened it, the same detective stood on the threshold, but this time uniformed officers were behind him, and in his hands he held an official document. He said not a word about their lies or the phone data. He simply stated that as part of the investigation into the disappearance of Sofia Nowak, their property would be searched. Any protest was futile. While one group of investigators began a methodical inspection of the house, the second most important group cordoned off the white van. Its doors were sealed, and a special tow truck carefully loaded it onto a platform to transport it to a sterile box at the forensic center. It was there, under bright lamps, away from prying eyes, that it was to reveal its secrets. Inspecting a car is almost a surgical procedure. Experts in white overalls, gloves, and masks began their work. They were not looking for something large and obvious. They were looking for a micro-world. With special vacuum cleaners equipped with disposable filters, they went over every centimeter of the upholstery. With sticky tapes, they took samples from the seats and floor mats. Ultraviolet lamps illuminated surfaces in search of biological traces. Hour by hour, they disassembled the interior atom by atom. And then, after several hours of painstaking work, they found what they were looking for. First, in the back seat, tucked into a crevice between the cushions, several microscopic fibers of a bright blue color were found. To an ordinary person, just trash. To a forensic expert, a potential match with the jeans Sofia was wearing. And then, under the rubber mat on the floor, they found it. The main discovery, one single long light-colored hair. It belonged neither to Marek nor to dark-haired Ewa. These findings, microscopic as they were, became the final nail in the coffin of the Kowalskis' freedom. The investigation now had not only their proven lies, but also physical traces potentially linking their car to the missing girl. This was more than enough. That same evening, detectives returned to the Kowalskis' house. But this time, not for questions. Marek and Ewa were read their rights and handcuffed. There was no surprise or fear on either of their faces. Only a cold, detached calm that frightened even seasoned operatives. They were detained on suspicion of involvement in a kidnapping. The samples taken from the van, the blue fibers and that very light-colored hair, were immediately sent to the laboratory for DNA testing. Now everything depended on its results. Would these particles, invisible to the naked eye, become irrefutable proof of their guilt, or would the investigation reach another dead end? While Marek and Ewa Kowalski sat in pre-trial detention cells and the evidence seized from their van was in the laboratory, a sluggish, tense pause settled in the investigation. It was a time of waiting, the most agonizing for any investigator. They had suspects. They had a strong reason for suspicion, their lies, confirmed by billing data. But they still lacked a direct, irrefutable link to Sofia herself. The Kowalskis behaved during interrogations just as they had at their first meeting. Coldly, calmly, detachedly. They were questioned separately. Attempts made to find inconsistencies in their testimonies, but they repeated the same thing like lovebirds. We were home. We don't know this girl. You are mistaken. They were ideal suspects. Too calm. Too confident. And all this time, the detectives understood that if the laboratory did not provide matches, they might have to release this couple. The entire weight of the case, all hopes for justice, now rested on the shoulders of the scientists in white coats. The first results came in after a few days. It was a report on the comparative analysis of microfibers. In forensics, this is a very delicate job. Experts took the very blue threads found in the van and compared them with samples taken from the jeans Sofia was wearing on the day of her disappearance. The comparison was based on dozens of parameters: fabric composition, weave type, chemical composition of the dye. This is not like DNA analysis. It cannot give a 100% yes or no answer, but it can say how likely it is that these fibers come from the same source. The expert's conclusion was unambiguous. The microfibers found in Kowalski's car were identical in all key parameters to the material of Zofia Nowak's jeans. This was not yet a knockout, but it was a very strong blow. Now the prosecution had not just a lie about their whereabouts, but also a material connection. A connection that the Kowalskis could no longer explain away as a simple coincidence. But the main decisive blow was yet to come. Everyone was waiting for the results of the genetic examination of that light hair. DNA analysis is the queen of all examinations. Its conclusions are almost impossible to dispute. And so, almost 1 week after Kowalski's arrest, a sealed envelope landed on the senior investigator's desk. Inside was a short, one-page report from the laboratory. It was written in dry, scientific language, full of terms, but its essence was crystal clear and damning. The genetic profile extracted from the hair found under the mat in Marek and Iwa Kowalski's van matched the genetic profile of Zofia Nowak with a probability of 99.999%. That was it. The end of all doubts. Checkmate. Science had given the final, irrevocable answer. Zofia Nowak was in that car. Her abductors were sitting in the next cell and continued to lie, not yet knowing that their lies had just been destroyed at a molecular level. Now the investigation had not just a hypothesis, but a scientific fact. And with this fact in hand, the detective re-entered the interrogation room. The game of "we know nothing" was over. A completely different conversation was about to begin. When the detective re-entered the interrogation room, he did not raise his voice or threaten. He simply silently placed a printout of the DNA expert's findings on the table in front of Marek Kowalski, one sheet of paper that weighed more than all their words spoken in the past few days. Marek looked at the document, then at the investigator, and for the first time in all this time, his cold composure cracked. But it was not panic or remorse. Something else flickered in his eyes: calculation. He understood that the old tactic of "we know nothing" no longer worked. And then, after a long pause, he spoke. And what he said made the investigators realize that they were dealing not with simple liars, but with someone far more cunning and resourceful. Their story changed dramatically. Now they did not deny having seen Zofia. On the contrary, they presented themselves as almost her saviors. In their new version, they were indeed driving along the highway on July 6th and saw a lonely, distressed girl on the roadside. Ewa, as she claimed, could not drive past. Her maternal heart, she said, simply would not allow her to leave a child alone on such a busy road. They stopped and asked what was wrong. Zofia allegedly told them that she had quarreled with her mother and was going to her friends in Sopot. The Kowalskis, being good Samaritans, of course offered her a ride. They described this journey in minute detail, how Zofia sat in the back seat, how they tried to engage her in conversation, how she remained mostly silent throughout the journey, looking out the window. All of this sounded chillingly plausible. And then came the crucial moment of their story. They stated that they drove her to the very entrance of Sopot. They dropped her off at a busy bus stop next to a small shop. Ewa even claimed that she gave her a few coins for the bus so that she wouldn't have to walk further. According to them, they saw her wave goodbye and walk towards the bus stop. After that, they turned around and drove home. This version was brilliant in its simplicity. It perfectly explained everything the investigation had. Why were their phones on the highway? Because they were driving to Sopot. Why were Zofia's hair and fibers found in their van? Because she was in their car. They did not deny the obvious. They simply took the facts that the police had and wove them into their own, completely new story. A story in which they were not abductors, but simply the last people to see Zofia alive and unharmed. This new legend put the investigation in an extremely difficult position. Yes, they had proof that Zofia was in the van, but now this fact had a logical and, worst of all, plausible explanation. The police still had no direct evidence that Kowalski had harmed her. The place where the body was found yielded no clues linking him to the suspects. Now the defense could easily state, yes, they gave her a ride, but they dropped her off. And what happened to her after that is not their fault. Look for whoever met her at that bus stop. The investigation, which seemed to be on the home stretch, had once again rolled back. Now detectives needed not just to prove that Zofia was in the car. They needed to prove that she never left that car alive. This new, smoothly concocted story from Kowalski was a real headache for the investigation. It was logical. It explained the evidence. And worst of all, it was almost impossible to disprove. Detectives could disbelieve them all they wanted, but their personal opinion is not evidence for a court. Something else needed to be found. Something that would destroy this image of good Samaritans. And since Kowalski had been so persistently lying about their movements, investigators decided to dig deeper into their lives. They started with what can tell more about a person today than any witness: their computers, tablets, and phones. Having obtained the appropriate warrant, the police seized all electronic devices from the suspect's home and transferred them to the cybercrime department. No one knew then that the memory of these soulless pieces of iron hid a truth far more terrible than anyone could have imagined. At first glance, their digital life was as boring and mundane as their real one. Ewa's browser history was filled with cooking sites and forums for housewives. Marek's, sites with building materials and car forums. Social media, photos from family celebrations, smiles, birthday greetings. All clean, decent, almost sterile. But specialists from the cyber department are people who are used to looking for what is hidden very deeply. They began to restore deleted files, check hidden folders, and analyze encrypted correspondence in messengers. And there, behind 7 locks of digital camouflage, they found a door to another world. A world that in no way fit the image of a quiet family couple. The analysis showed that Marek and Ewa were active participants in several closed internet communities. These were not just some strange forums. The subject matter of these groups was narrow and monstrous. They were devoted to materials with sexualized violence against children. In their correspondence with other participants of these communities, there was not a drop of shock or disgust. On the contrary, they discussed this with cold, almost scientific interest. They exchanged links, shared their fantasies. The investigators reading these logs were horrified. An abyss opened before them. It turned out that Ewa was not just a passive observer. Often she was precisely the initiator of these conversations, pushing her husband, discussing details with him. Their normal family life was merely a screen behind which hid 2 predators who for years had been feeding their darkest desires in the anonymity of the internet. And then everything fell into place. The investigation finally had a motive. Now their trip on highway on the 6th of July looked completely different. This was not coincidence. This was not a spontaneous act of kindness. Judging by their correspondence, at some point they decided that fantasies alone were no longer enough for them. They decided to move to action. And on that day, they were not simply driving on their business. They purposefully went out hunting. They were looking for a victim. And they found her. A small, lonely girl on the roadside who in their perverted consciousness was the perfect object for realizing what they had dreamed about for so long. Now the version that they simply gave her a ride and dropped her off crumbled to dust. The police understood that Sofia Nowak had not a single chance to escape from the very moment when this white van braked beside her. This discovery in their computers became a real joker for the investigation. Now they had not only the hair in the car, but also the key to their dark souls. The detectives understood that they were dealing not simply with kidnappers, but with predators who had long and purposefully prepared for the jump. And now, armed with this new knowledge, they decided to completely change the interrogation tactics. Enough polite questions and attempts to catch them on small inconsistencies. The time had come for psychological warfare. The main strength of the Kowalskis was their unity, their common, well-rehearsed lie. And it was precisely this wall between them that needed to be destroyed. They were brought back to the investigative department again, but this time they were separated into different rooms, completely excluding any possibility of contact. The interrogation began simultaneously but in completely different keys. Before Marek, a thick folder was placed on the table. It contained not protocols, but printouts. Dozens of pages of their correspondence from those very closed chats. Every word, Every perverted fantasy that he thought was safely hidden in the depths of the internet now lay before him on paper. The investigator silently leafed through the pages, reading aloud the most explicit fragments. Marek first tried to deny, said it was a fake, that he had been hacked. But the longer this continued, the more the mask of composure fell from him. His world was collapsing right before his eyes, and in the neighboring room they played a different game with Ava. She was also shown printouts, but the main blow was delivered from another side. The investigator, looking directly into her eyes, said in a calm, almost sympathetic tone, "Ava, we know everything. Your husband has started talking. He is telling us everything. And he says it was your idea, that you pushed him into it. He is trying to shift all the blame onto you to save his own skin." This was a classic, but no less effective bluff. Eva did not know what her husband was actually saying. She was in complete isolation, and in her consciousness, poisoned by the paranoia of their secret life. This lie from the investigator sounded like absolute truth. The thought that Marek, her partner in the darkest fantasies, was betraying her to save himself became the last straw for her. And the dam burst. Their common defense line collapsed in an instant. Eva, trying to save herself, began to talk. She cried, screamed, portrayed herself as a victim. In her version, Marek was a monster, a tyrant who had dominated her for years and forced her to participate in his terrible fantasies. According to her, that day it was specifically he who saw the girl on the road. It was specifically he who forced her to lure Sofia into the car. She claimed that she was terrified but was afraid to contradict him. And when the investigators came to Marek and told him what his wife was saying, he exploded. He understood that she had betrayed him, and he began to tell his version. A version in which Eva was already the monster. He claimed that she was the real brain of their couple, that she had been inciting him for years, saying that just talking on the internet was not enough. That on that day, it was specifically she who insisted that they go searching. Their interrogation turned into a disgusting quarrel where each tried to drown the other, portraying themselves as merely innocent victims of circumstances. They accused each other of everything, revealing more and more terrible details of what happened in their van. They themselves, with their words, destroyed the last loophole that could have saved them. Their alliance fell apart, and now the investigation had not just evidence, but two mutual hate-filled confessions. These mutual accusations, full of hatred and attempts to exonerate themselves, were a real breakthrough for the investigation. The wall of silence collapsed. But behind this wall was not a clear picture of the crime, but a dirty, tangled pile of half-truths and outright lies. Each of them painted their own version of events in which he or she was merely a frightened puppet in the hands of the other. They both confessed to the kidnapping, but when it came to what exactly happened to Sofia in their van and in the forest, their testimonies diverged. They shifted responsibility for the most terrible thing onto each other. And although the investigators had no doubt that both were guilty, they needed something more than the words of two liars. They needed physical, irrefutable proof of what actually happened. And for this proof, they returned again to the main silent witness, to the white van. The first examination gave them hair and microfibers, evidence that placed Sofia inside the car. But now, knowing about the Kowalski's dark fantasies, the forensic experts were looking for traces of a completely different nature. They decided to conduct a repeat, much more in-depth examination using an arsenal that is usually applied in the most hopeless cases. The van was again rolled into a sterile box. The experts darkened the room, creating almost complete darkness. And then they took out sprayers with a special chemical reagent, luminol. This substance, which became famous thanks to crime series, has one unique property. Upon contact with the tiniest, even washed away traces of biological materials, it begins to glow in the dark with a ghostly blue light. This is the last hope to find what the criminals tried to destroy. An expert in a protective suit began methodically spraying reagent throughout the entire cargo compartment of the van. At first, there was nothing in the darkness. But as the fine dispersed cloud of luminol settled on the surfaces, barely noticeable flashes began to occur in different places. And then, in the rear part of the compartment, on the floor, an entire constellation flashed up. Bright, distinct spots of blue glow that were not visible under ordinary light. This meant one thing. The Kowalskis had tried to cover their tracks. They cleaned, washed, scrubbed, but they could not destroy everything at the microscopic level. For the forensic experts, this was like finding a treasure map. They carefully took samples from each glowing area and immediately sent them to the laboratory for DNA analysis. Now all that remained was to wait and hope that sufficient genetic material had been preserved in these invisible traces. The answer from the laboratory came after several days and became the final, most emphatic exclamation point in this case. The analysis confirmed the investigators' worst fears. The samples taken from the glowing spots contained a mixed genetic profile. They contained Zofia Nowak's DNA, and they contained Marek Kowalski's DNA. This was irrefutable scientific proof. It destroyed their last line of defense. It proved that what happened in this van was not simply kidnapping. Violence had been committed here. Now the investigation had the complete picture, not based on the contradictory words of two monsters, but confirmed by cold, impartial science. The case was essentially solved. All that remained was to present all this evidence to the court and ensure that the justice they had fought for so long would finally triumph. With this final, irrefutable evidence in hand, the investigators arranged a final confrontation. This was no longer an interrogation in the usual sense of the word. This was a statement of fact. The end of the game. The detectives alternately entered the rooms to Marek and Ewa and silently placed the laboratory report before them. The very one where it was written in black and white that in their van, in the traces they had so carefully tried to wash away, Zofia's blood and Marek's genetic material had been found. They expected repentance, tears, full confession, but they received none of this. The Kowalskis' reaction to this irrefutable evidence became the final touch to their psychological portraits. Marek, after reading the conclusion, leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was a quiet laugh, devoid of any merriment. He looked at the investigator and declared that all this was a circus, that the police, having failed to find the real criminal, had decided to pin everything on him. He said that all the evidence was fabricated, that the hair had been planted on him, and the examination results had been falsified. He clung to his lie to the very end, trying to present himself as a victim of the system. He showed not a drop of emotion, not a shadow of sympathy, only cold, calculating rage. Ewa's reaction was different, but no less disgusting. When she realized that the investigation had evidence of violence, she burst into tears. But these were not tears of repentance. These were tears of self-pity. She gave partial confessional testimony confirming that they had kidnapped the girl and that her husband had committed violence against her. But she swore to the very end that she had not wanted this. In her version, she was merely a frightened witness who was afraid to intervene. And when it came to the most terrible thing, about how Zofia's life was ended, she flatly refused to take responsibility. She declared that Marek had done it, alone, after they had already arrived in the forest. She tried to make a deal with the investigation, selling her husband in exchange for her own salvation. They never obtained a full, sincere confession from them, but it was no longer needed. The totality of the collected evidence was so powerful that the Kowalskis' words no longer had any significance. The investigation had everything: their lie about their whereabouts, confirmed by billing records, Sofia's hair and fibers in their car, their monstrous internet activity that revealed the motive, their mutual accusations that destroyed their common lie, and finally, the irrefutable DNA evidence of the violence committed. The investigation was finished. The enormous multi-volume case, assembled piece by piece, was transferred to the prosecutor's office, and from there to the court. Now the fate of Marek and Ewa Kowalski was to be decided not by the investigator, but by the judge and jury. And so, when the case was handed over to court, from all these scattered pieces of evidence, contradictory testimonies, and cold scientific facts, the prosecution assembled a unified, complete, and terrifying picture of what had happened. This was no longer a version or assumption. This was an official reconstruction of the last hours of Zofia Nowak's life, restored piece by piece. The story that sounded in the courtroom was devoid of any doubts and understatements. According to the prosecution materials, on the morning of the 6th of July 2022, Marek and Ewa Kowalski got into their white van not to go about business. They went out hunting. For years, feeding their perverted fantasies in the dark corners of the internet, they finally decided to bring them to reality. They purposefully moved along the busy Gdansk-Sopot highway, looking out for a lonely, vulnerable victim, and they found her. A little girl with a backpack, offended at the whole world and resolutely walking along the roadside, was for them the perfect target. They stopped, and Ewa, using her appearance as an ordinary, good-natured woman, played the role of a caring aunt. She spoke with Sofia, offered to give her a ride. For a child, tired and upset, this couple did not look like a threat. She trusted them and got into the car. As soon as the van door slammed shut, her fate was decided. Instead of driving straight towards Sopot as they promised, Marek turned off the highway onto an inconspicuous country road leading deep into the forest area. All of Zofia's attempts to ask where they were going were ignored. They took her to a remote, deserted place where no one would hear cries for help. There, away from prying eyes, they stopped pretending to be good Samaritans. In this forest, in the cargo compartment of their van, they committed against the child those very violent acts they had fantasized about for so long. This was confirmed by irrefutable traces found by forensic scientists. And after they satisfied their most base desires, they faced the question, what to do with the witness? And they made a cold-blooded, calculated decision. To hide their first monstrous crime, they committed a second, even more terrible one. They took Zofia's life. And after that, they simply carried her lifeless body out of the van and left it in the forest, among the trees, like an unwanted thing, hoping it would never be found. The trial of Marek and Ewa Kowalski began almost a year after their arrest, on the 22nd of July 2023, in the District Court of Gdansk. This day became the culmination of all the titanic work done by the investigation. All the collected evidence, all the interrogation protocols, all the expert conclusions, all of this was gathered into one large, weighty case that was placed on the judge's desk. In the courtroom reigned an oppressive atmosphere. On one side sat prosecutors confident in their righteousness. On the other, the Kowalski lawyers who had to defend those whom all society had already recognized as monsters. And in the center, in the dock, sat they themselves, Marek and Ewa. As during interrogations, they showed no emotions, simply looked ahead as if everything happening did not concern them. Over several weeks, a real battle unfolded in court. The prosecution methodically, step by step, built their evidentiary base. They showed the jury that very recording from the dashboard camera where the white van stops next to Sofia. They presented billing data that proved the defendant's lies. They demonstrated forensic reports about the hair and blue fibers. They read aloud excerpts from their internet correspondence, revealing the motive. And finally, they presented the results of DNA analysis found after processing the van with luminol, irrefutable proof of the committed violence. Each piece of evidence was like a stone that fell on the scales of justice. The defense tried to find loopholes until the very end. The Kowalski lawyers did not deny that their clients had given the girl a ride. They clung to this version to the end. Their main line was that there was no direct proof of their involvement specifically in the murder. They claimed that the accusation was built on circumstantial evidence, and the confessions were beaten out under psychological pressure. Marek at trial continued to insist that the evidence was fabricated. Ewa cried and said she was afraid of her husband. But all these attempts to demolish the case looked pathetic against the background of that mountain of evidence that the investigation had collected. The court, having heard both sides, considered the evidence presented by the prosecution more than sufficient for issuing a guilty verdict. On the day of the verdict announcement, there were no free seats in the courtroom. The judge read his decision in a monotonous, dispassionate voice. He found Marek Kowalski guilty of kidnapping, violent sexual acts and murder committed for the purpose of concealing another crime. The sentence was the harshest possible: life imprisonment in a maximum security correctional colony with additional assignment of compulsory psychiatric treatment. Ewa Kowalska, whom the court recognized as an accomplice and instigator, but not the direct executor of the most brutal act, received 15 years imprisonment in a strict regime colony. Justice, albeit belated, triumphed. But for Sofia's family, this verdict could not return the most important thing. It only put a period to this terrible story. A story about how an ordinary children's quarrel and a fateful meeting on the roadside led to an unthinkable tragedy, and about how the most terrible evil sometimes hides behind the mask of the most ordinary normality. The verdict put a legal end to this case, but could not erase the scar that this story left on society. The case of Sofia Nowak caused enormous resonance throughout Poland. It forced thousands of parents to talk once more with their children about what real danger is, and that it does not always look like it does in books. This tragedy provoked heated public discussions. People demanded to strengthen safety measures on the roads, install more working cameras, create systems for rapid notification about missing children, and most importantly, it forced the authorities and society as a whole to pay closer attention to the dark corners of the internet, to those very closed communities where for years, as in an incubator, the most monstrous fantasies are nurtured and strengthened. While the country discussed how to prevent a repeat of such events, the legal machine completed its work. Soon after the trial, Marek and Ewa Kowalski were transferred to their places of serving punishment. Their lawyers, as expected, filed appeals, trying to contest the verdict and soften the punishment. But all their attempts were rejected by higher instances. The court considered the evidence exhaustive and the verdict just. It entered into legal force, and now for Marek and Ewa Kowalski began their long, hopeless life behind bars. The final point in this case was put definitively. The monsters were in a cage, but the memory of the little girl with a backpack behind her back, who on one sunny day simply quarreled with her mother and went toward her little adventure, will forever remain a painful reminder. A reminder that the most terrible evil is not a faceless shadow in a gateway, but a smile and kind word from those who should never, under any circumstances, have been trusted. The experiment failed. These 3 words, spoken in a quiet, almost indifferent voice, made the school psychologist freeze. They were recorded in the log of a standard conversation on the 5th of February, 2019. Their author, 13-year-old Leo, a boy with a reputation as a model student and a beloved grandson. In the complete silence of the office, he continued, looking somewhere into the distance. I simply unscrewed the light bulb. I wanted to feel grief. So much is written in books about how it tears the soul apart. But I felt nothing. Nothing at all. The experiment failed. This sentence rang out 3 months after the case of his 74-year-old grandmother Eleanor's death had been closed. The official verdict was accident. The elderly woman had fallen in the darkness on the steep staircase of her old farmhouse. A tragedy, sadly common. The case was closed, the town sympathized with the inconsolable family, and Leo played the role of the grieving grandson so convincingly that no one entertained even a shadow of a doubt. But this cold, detached confession, made not to the police but to the psychologist, sent the system reeling. It turned a closed case into an open wound and forced everyone to look at the perfect boy through different eyes. To understand how this happened, we must go back 3 months. To that November day when the tragedy at the house on the outskirts of Silver Creek seemed only a tragedy and not someone's monstrous experiment. To understand this experiment, one must first see the world it destroyed. A world that seemed unshakable. Every weekend, 13-year-old Leo spent at the old farmhouse of his grandmother Eleanor, which stood a few kilometers from the quiet town of Silver Creek. This was their small kingdom, their tradition, known to everyone around them. The house, surrounded by old maples and permeated with the scent of apple pie and dusty books, was an entire universe for Leo, and Eleanor was its center. At 74, she remained a woman with a sharp mind and strong character, a mistress who knew every corner of her land and every book in her huge library. Their bond seemed perfect, almost cinematic. Neighbors driving by on the gravel road often saw them together. Here they were raking fallen leaves in the yard. There, Eleanor was teaching her grandson to distinguish constellations in the clear Canadian sky. Leo's parents tearfully told friends that their son preferred to spend an evening reading Dickens to his grandmother rather than playing video games with peers. Leo helped chop wood for the fireplace, listened to her endless stories of the past, of times when Silver Creek consisted of only a few streets, and disappeared for hours into her library, absorbed in the worlds she opened up to him. In the eyes of the whole town, they were not just grandmother and grandson. They were kindred spirits, between whom a special, invisible thread was stretched. This idyllic picture, woven from hundreds of such quiet, predictable days, was the main alibi for the future crime. No one, neither parents nor neighbors nor teachers, could have suspected that behind the facade of this touching affection hid a cold, analytical mind that was already preparing for its first and last experiment. To everyone around, Leo was a quiet, gifted boy who adored his grandmother. And adoration, as is known, leaves no room for evil intent. This familiar, secure world collapsed on the morning of the 18th of November 2018. On that Sunday, Leo's parents arrived as usual to pick up their son. But no one opened the door. After several minutes of knocking and worried calls, the father broke down the lock. Inside the house, there was deathly silence, broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock. And at the foot of the steep wooden staircase leading to the second floor lay Eleanor's motionless body. On that cold November day, it did not occur to anyone that the cause of this tragedy lay not in poor lighting or an accidental misstep, but in a light bulb cold-bloodedly unscrewed from the socket. To the Silver Creek police who arrived at the scene, everything looked painfully obvious. And this obviousness formed the basis for the medical examiner's official conclusion, which sounded dry and unassailable. Death occurred as a result of a craniocerebral injury and multiple fractures sustained from a fall down the stairs. For the justice system, this was the end of the story. But for us who know Leo's confession, this conclusion sounds like a failure. How could they have missed everything? The answer lies in the crime scene investigation report. The call to the emergency center came in at 7:15 in the morning on Sunday. The patrol officer who arrived at Eleanor's farm documented a picture typical of an accident. Doors and windows were locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, struggle, or robbery. Perfect order reigned in the house, except for the most terrible thing: the body of the elderly woman at the foot of the stairs. Beside her on the floor lay a fallen book. Everything indicated that Eleanor had gotten up at night, perhaps to read or use the bathroom, and had fallen in the dark. The steep wooden staircase in the old farmhouse did not forgive mistakes. The only witness, her grandson Leo, was upstairs in the guest bedroom. According to the parents, they found him sitting on the bed in a state of deep shock. He could only say that he had been sleeping and had heard nothing until his mother and father arrived. His behavior did not arouse any suspicion. He looked like any other teenager faced with such a terrible loss. All the facts coalesced into a sad but simple to the point of banality picture. An elderly person, a dark staircase, a misstep. The case was closed as quickly as it had been opened with the notation "accident." The family began their difficult journey of mourning. The town offered its condolences, and the file moved to the archive. No one asked the crucial question: why was it absolutely dark on the stair landing, where a faint nightlight always burned that night? This detail seemed insignificant, dismissed as a burned-out light bulb. No one could have guessed that this light bulb was not burned out, but carefully unscrewed and hidden. No one could have guessed that this light bulb was not burned out, but carefully unscrewed and hidden. And yet, its absence was documented. In the report of the first officer to arrive at the scene, there is a short, almost mundane line: light bulb missing from the socket on the upper stair landing. The socket is empty. In the context of the tragic fall of an elderly woman, this seemed like an annoying but perfectly explainable cause of what happened. For the viewer who knows Leo's confession, this sentence is the first material evidence, the first thread that no one pulled on at the time. Of course, this fact did not go entirely unnoticed. The officer conducting a standard questioning asked Leo about it. The boy, who by all accounts was in a state of deep shock, quietly replied that the light bulb must have burned out a couple of days ago. Grandmother kept meaning to change it, but she must have forgotten, he added, and there was nothing strange about that. Something was constantly breaking, burning out, or needing repair in the old farmhouse. That was part of its character. Who would think to doubt the words of a grief-stricken teenager who had just found his grandmother dead? His answer was logical. It fit perfectly into the picture of the accident, and thus the question was exhaustively answered. The police were not criminal experts. They saw a family tragedy, not a crime scene. Thus, due to the lack of direct traces of violence and the presence of an absolutely credible explanation for the only oddity, the investigation, which had basically never begun, was closed. Everything fit. The door locked from the inside, the body without signs of struggle, and the testimony of the inconsolable grandson. There wasn't a single lead, not a single fact that screamed, "Something is wrong here." The file moved to the archive, and the family sank into the silence of mourning. And in that silence, Leo silently observed the consequences of his experiment for the next 3 months, waiting to feel at least something. But inside him, emptiness still reigned. But inside him, emptiness still reigned. And while Leo analyzed this inner silence for 3 months, the system he had so easily deceived began its slow, ponderous turn. After the confession in the psychologist's office, the case of the accident at Eleanor's farm was immediately reopened. But now the investigators looked at it with completely different eyes. And the first thing they did was ask the classic questions. Who had a conflict with the deceased? And who benefited from her death? The answer was found surprisingly quickly and seemed to be right on the surface. The name of that answer was Robert, Eleanor's only son and Leo's uncle. He was pointed out by the neighbor, who, upon repeated questioning, recalled an important detail. About a week before the tragedy, while working in his garden, he heard loud, angry voices coming from Eleanor's house. It was an argument. He couldn't understand all the words, but he clearly heard Robert shouting something about the last chance and debt hole. And in response, Eleanor's firm, albeit tired voice rang out, I won't give you another cent. You have to learn to face the consequences of your actions. This mundane conflict, which no one had paid attention to at the time, now took on an ominous color in the light of the new investigation. It started rolling. The investigators dug deeper, and the picture that emerged was, frankly, textbook. Robert's financial reports screamed disaster. An unsuccessful business plan he had embarked on a couple of years ago had gone awry and left huge debts. His credit cards were blocked, and notices from collection agencies were arriving in his mailbox. He was desperate, frantically searching for money, and apparently, his mother had been his last hope. Eleanor, a woman of the old school, had clearly refused to sponsor her son's next failure, which had led to that argument. The motive was obvious. Eliminating his mother not only solved his financial problems in the long term through inheritance, but could also have been an act of desperate rage. Robert instantly transformed from the grieving son into a person of interest, the main and only suspect. To the Silver Creek detectives, the case seemed almost solved. They had a perfect suspect with an ironclad motive. A version was already building up in their minds. That night, Robert secretly entered the house, perhaps to try to persuade his mother one last time or even to steal something valuable. She caught him. An argument flared up, and in a fit of rage, he pushed her down the stairs and then staged an accident. This version explained everything, except for one thing: how he managed to do it without leaving a single trace. But the investigators were sure that was only a matter of time. Now only one thing remained for them: to break through his defense, to find a hole in his statements. They did not yet know that Robert's alibi would become the impenetrable wall against which their entire coherent theory would crash, forcing them to return to the beginning and look in the direction that their minds refused to accept. They did not yet know that Robert's alibi would become the impenetrable wall against which their entire coherent theory would crash, forcing them to return to the beginning and look in the direction that their minds refused to accept. And this wall was not built of words, but of cold, irrefutable digital facts. The first blow against the investigation's version was dealt by geolocation. On the night of Eleanor's death, from the evening of the 17th to the morning of the 18th of November, Robert's mobile phone was 150 kilometers from Silver Creek. He wasn't just passing through. The cellular provider logs showed that the device was stably connecting to cell towers in the Red Deer area for several hours. Numbers don't lie. Robert physically could not be in two places at once. But that was just the beginning. The investigators pulled his credit card statements, and the digital trail became even clearer. That night, when his mother took her last step in the darkness, Robert paid by card at a bar called Dusty Boot in Red Deer. The records showed several transactions, one at 21:45, another around midnight. He wasn't just in another city. He was sitting in a bar, buying drinks, living his life while the tragedy unfolded in his family home. To settle all questions once and for all, the detectives drove to that bar. And there they found the last living proof of his innocence. The bartender, an elderly man with tired eyes, remembered Robert well. "Yes, a guy like that was here," he said, polishing a glass. "Sat alone in the corner, gloomier than a thundercloud. Ordered whiskey, then another. You could tell the man had problems. Left just before closing, around 2 in the morning. Robert's alibi was ironclad. It was confirmed by 3 independent sources: mobile provider data, bank transactions, and witness testimony. The motive, as strong as it may have seemed, crumbled into dust in the face of the simple fact: he could not have done it. Gritting their teeth, the investigation was forced to officially remove him from the list of suspects. And in that moment, a deafening silence hung in the interrogation room. Their most logical, most convenient version had collapsed. The investigation had reached a dead end. Or had it? Once the dust had settled, the detectives realized that only one path remained for them. A single lead that until then had seemed like madness, like the fantasy of a traumatized teenager. Now that the version with the indebted uncle was buried, they had to look at it with new eyes. They were left alone with the quiet, composed confession of 13-year-old Leo. And now, they had to find out what lay behind his words. Invention, or monstrous truth. They were left alone with the quiet, composed confession of 13-year-old Leo. And now, they had to find out what lay behind his words. Invention, or monstrous truth. To find the answer, the detectives started from the beginning, with his behavior in the first days and weeks after the tragedy. And what they saw made them shudder, for it was a perfect, flawless performance. The refusal to eat, which his parents attributed to shock. The long hours he spent in complete silence in his room. And of course, the tears at the funeral. Quiet, bitter. Exactly what everyone expected from a boy who had lost the person closest to him. The spectators know that all of this was imitation, but to those around him, it looked like a textbook example of deep, crippling grief. Parents, teachers, family friends, all unanimously described the same picture. It was as if the light went out in him, his mother later told the investigators. He hardly spoke, hardly ate, just sat in his room with books he had read with Eleanor. We thought his heart was broken. This version was so natural that it raised no doubts. The parents saw their son broken and tried to surround him with care, unaware that they were watching not grief, but its virtuoso performance. The same thing happened at school. From the diligent student, Leo turned into a shadow. Teachers noted in their reports, became withdrawn, constantly stares out the window, does not participate in discussions. They saw a teenager experiencing his first great loss, and according to all pedagogical instructions, gave him space and time, assuming he was simply trying to cope with the trauma. Every gesture, every word, every silence was measured with mathematical precision. He did exactly what society expected of him. He cried when he should cry, and was silent when they expected silence from him. Leo created around himself a cocoon of sorrow so dense and convincing that not a single person thought to try and look inside. He didn't just deceive everyone. He used their sympathy and their preconceptions about grief as his most reliable shield. No one saw anything other than tragic normalcy in his behavior. No one could even imagine that in the silence of his room, he was not mourning his grandmother, but making dispassionate notes and analyzing the results of his experiment. And it was these notes, hidden from the whole world, that would soon become the key that opened the door to his cold, frightening mind. But before the police could find this key, Leo handed it to them himself, voluntarily. He didn't need a confession under pressure. He didn't need evidence. He simply told everything himself. 5th of February, 2019. The school psychologist's office, Dr. Miles. It was a normal, scheduled meeting, part of the support program the school had offered Leo after the tragic loss. In the quiet room, smelling of paper and calming tea, Dr. Miles asked standard questions about how the boy was coping, about his feelings, about dreams. He expected to hear of grief, of emptiness, of anger, everything that fit the picture of mourning. But he heard something that made his blood run cold in his veins. In Dr. Miles's official report, this moment is recorded with protocol accuracy. During the session, Leo, with an even voice and without visible emotional reactions, stated that the death of his grandmother Eleanor was not an accident. And then, the sentence that set this entire story in motion rang out. I simply unscrewed the light bulb. I wanted to feel grief. So much is written in books about how it tears the soul apart. But I felt nothing. Nothing at all. The experiment failed. This was not remorse. This was not a cry for help. This was the statement of a scientific fact. Dr. Miles had no choice in that moment. Professional duty and the law obligated him to immediately report the confession of a serious crime to the police and child protective services. He was a psychologist, but sitting before him was not just a traumatized teenager. Sitting before him was the author of a cold-blooded, calculated act, disappointed not by what he had done, but by the fact that he had not received the desired emotional result. One phone call, and the case that had been gathering dust in the archives for 3 months returned to the detectives' desks, turning into the loudest and most chilling investigation in the history of Silver Creek. One phone call, and the case that had been gathering dust in the archives for 3 months returned to the detectives' desks, turning into the loudest and most chilling investigation in the history of Silver Creek. And the next morning, the 6th of February, this call took material form. The police received an official letterhead printed report from Dr. Miles. In dry protocol language, it laid out what sent a shiver down the backs of experienced investigators. The machinery of justice, once stalled, began its movement in the opposite direction with a deafening screech. The first reaction was, of course, shock, mixed with healthy skepticism. A confession from a 13-year-old teenager made to a psychologist, that is an extremely delicate matter. It could have been an invention, a desperate cry for attention, the result of trauma that had taken a bizarre form. But Leo's words were too specific, too cold, and devoid of any drama. There was neither remorse nor boasting in them, only analytical precision. That forced the detectives to act. The police chief's order was brief: immediately reopen the case of Eleanor's death. Leo's status changed in a second. From the inconsolable grandson and key witness, he became the main and only person of interest. The dusty box with the case materials returned from the archive. Old photos, reports, conclusions. All of it was now viewed from an entirely new perspective. And that line in the report of the first patrol officer, light bulb missing from the socket, which had previously seemed like an annoying everyday detail, now literally glowed on the page, transforming from an explanation into the main piece of evidence. The investigators picked up the receiver and made the hardest call of their careers, to Leo's parents. They had to inform them that their son, whom they had been trying to pull out of the whirlpool of grief the whole time, was now at the center of the murder investigation of their own mother. The world of this family, already shattered by the loss, now crumbled into 1,000 fragments. But the investigators understood. A confession alone, as shocking as it was, would not be enough for the court. Any good lawyer would argue it into the ground, portraying it as the fantasy of a traumatized boy. Words are just words. They needed something bigger. They needed material evidence that would irrefutably link Leo's narrative to reality. They had the story, told by the perpetrator. Now they needed the physical confirmation of that story, and they were almost certain where to look. The next step was a search warrant. They had to get into Leo's room. The next step was a search warrant. They had to get into Leo's room. But getting into this room proved not to be so easy. Even before the detectives could officially formulate their request, they ran into a deaf, impenetrable wall. Leo's parents hired one of the best lawyers in the province. For them, this was not just a legal move, but an act of desperate defense. Their world had just been destroyed for the second time. First they lost their mother, and now they were being told that their own grief-stricken son might have been involved. Their position, articulated by the lawyer, was simple and humanly understandable. "Our son has gone through a terrible trauma," they said. "He found his grandmother. His psyche is broken. He made it all up." This version was their life raft in the ocean of horror. They clung to the idea that Leo's confession was nothing more than a monstrous fantasy born of grief and guilt. Perhaps he blamed himself for not being able to help, and his mind created this chilling story to somehow cope with reality. Therefore, there could be no talk of a voluntary search of his room, his personal safe space. The lawyer was categorical. You will not traumatize him further. This refusal, this angry denial, created the legal barrier that the investigators feared. They couldn't just walk into the house. Their hands were tied. Now they had no other choice. To gain access to potential evidence, they had to go to a judge and request a search warrant, providing strong reasons to believe that something connected to the crime might actually be in the teenager's room. This turned the investigation into a race against time. They had to convince the judge of their legitimacy before any potential evidence, if it even existed, could be destroyed. This turned the investigation into a race against time. They had to convince the judge of their legitimacy before any potential evidence, if it even existed, could be destroyed. The judge, having reviewed Dr. Miles's report and Leo's cold, emotionless quote, did not hesitate for a second. The warrant was signed. And on the 8th of February, in the presence of the parents frozen in horror and their lawyer, 2 detectives entered Leo's room. It was the room of an ordinary teenager, books on the shelves, a computer on the desk. Nothing sinister. But in the desk drawer, under a stack of school notebooks, they found what they were looking for. An ordinary checkered notebook. And on the first page, written in neat, almost calligraphic handwriting, was hypothesis. Strong emotional shock can be artificially initiated. This was not just a diary entry. This was the thesis of a scientific paper. The detectives held their breath as they flipped through the pages. This was not a diary, but a laboratory journal. A cold-blooded, detailed report of an experiment on his own family. The next entry read, Method: elimination of the light source on the object's path of movement at night. Probability of fall over 80%. He did not write grandmother. He wrote object. And further followed observations, dated to the days after her death. Observation: no emotional reaction. Appetite: normal. Sleep: undisturbed. Imitation of grief is proceeding successfully. Adults react predictably. Every line in this notebook was a punch. It shattered the parents' last hope that their son was a victim of trauma. This was no invention. This was a plan, executed with icy precision. The journal became the irrefutable evidence the investigation needed. It connected Leo's confession to the physical world, turning his words into an indictment written by his own hand. On the same day, the 8th of February 2019, Leo was arrested. Now the justice system faced a question far more complex than just proving guilt. They had to look into the mind of the author of this journal and try to understand what had produced such a cold, callous intellect. They had to look into the mind of the author of this journal and try to understand what had produced such a cold, callous intellect. The first attempt was made during the official interrogation, which took place the day after his arrest. In the protocol, conducted in the presence of the lawyer and parents, there is a short but unsettling note from the investigator. Answered all questions calmly, without visible emotion, maintained eye contact. In the sterile interrogation room, where the adults could barely control their tension, sat a 13-year-old boy who behaved as if he were discussing a book he had read, not the death of his own grandmother. When that laboratory journal was placed on the table, he showed neither surprise nor fear. He simply nodded and confirmed, "Yes, that's mine." The detective, who had seen many things in his career, asked the main question that had plagued everyone since the beginning. Why, Leo? Why did you do this? His answer was neither a justification nor a confession of guilt in the usual sense. It was an explanation. Scientific interest, he said, as if answering a question about a school physics project. In that moment, as those present later recalled, there was absolute, icy silence in the room. The interrogation confirmed everything they already knew. Leo's story was coherent, logical, and absolutely monstrous. He calmly recounted how he wished his grandmother good night in the evening, went upstairs, unscrewed the light bulb, and went to sleep. But for the court, more was needed than just words spoken in an office. The investigation had to find the last thread that connected his narrative to the physical world, to that empty socket on the stair landing in Eleanor's house. The investigation had to find the last thread that connected his narrative to the physical world, to that empty socket on the stair landing in Eleanor's house. And they found it. Not in the garbage can behind the house, where the 25-watt bulb had long since disappeared without a trace, but at the crime scene itself. The forensic technicians, now working not with an accident, but with suspicion of murder, returned to the old farmhouse. Their task was to examine that socket under the microscope. And there, a line appeared in their report that means nothing to a layman, but for this case, it became the final nail in the coffin of the fantasy version. The forensic expert report stated, microscopic traces of fibers, characteristic of wiping, were discovered on the metal base of the socket. Wiping. Who in their right mind would wipe a light bulb socket? You don't do that when cleaning. You don't do that when changing a light bulb. You only do that with one goal: to destroy traces. This seemingly insignificant detail was a deafening scream confirming malicious intent. The experts continued their work. Under the microscope, they discovered what was left after the wiping: blurred, fragmentary fingerprints. They were not sufficient for complete identification, but their arrangement was much more important. The report continued. The nature and arrangement of the blurred traces fully correspond to a twisting motion, characteristic of unscrewing an object from the socket. That was it. The physical confirmation of his words, frozen in the metal. Leo didn't just say he unscrewed the light bulb. He also wiped the socket and the bulb itself, apparently instinctively or after reading about it in those books, to conceal his fingerprints. This small, almost imperceptible action spoke of his cold-bloodedness and calculation more than all his confessions. This was not an impulse. This was an operation. This evidence, indirectly but irrefutably, confirmed Leo's entire story. He didn't invent it while sitting in the psychologist's office. He was describing a real act he had committed, and that act left its microscopic but indelible trace. Now the investigation had a complete, closed chain: confession, laboratory journal with a detailed plan, and physical evidence at the crime scene that perfectly matched that plan. The investigation's journey was complete. Now began the journey of justice, and the entire town of Silver Creek was about to hear the details of this blood-curdling experiment in court. The investigation's journey was complete. Now began the journey of justice, and the entire town of Silver Creek was about to hear the details of this blood-curdling experiment in court. And when those details rang out, they proved to be more terrible than all the conjectures. The complete picture of the events of that night was reconstructed from Leo's own words: calm, detailed, and devoid of any emotions. It all began on Saturday, the 17th of November, at 22:05. This mundane precision with which he named the time emphasized how calculated every one of his steps was. At that time, he wished his grandmother good night as usual. Eleanor was sitting in the living room with a book, and he said he was going to sleep. She smiled at him, unaware that this was their last conversation. Leo went upstairs, but instead of going into the guest room, he stopped on the dark stair landing. Silence reigned all around, broken only by the creaking of old floorboards. He waited until the light downstairs went out, and then, standing on tiptoe, he calmly and methodically unscrewed the 25-watt light bulb from the socket. He didn't break it. He didn't throw it away. He carefully placed it in the pocket of his pajama pants, went to his room, got into bed, and, as he himself claimed, fell asleep almost immediately. He slept peacefully all night while the deadly trap waited for its hour in the darkness of the first floor. In the morning, upon waking, he went downstairs and discovered the body, according to his words. His first reaction was not a scream, but action. He did not call the emergency services. He called his parents, and with a trembling voice he had rehearsed so well internally, reported the accident. And while they were rushing in a panic to the farm, he performed the final act of his plan. He went to the backyard, took the light bulb out of his pocket and threw it into the large garbage bin. He knew that the garbage would be collected in a couple of days and the evidence would disappear forever. This narration, presented by him without hesitation or contradiction, explained everything. It explained why it was dark on the landing. It explained where the light bulb had gone. It explained why he, and not the emergency services, was the first to know about the tragedy. His version was perfect. This was not the confession of a repentant sinner, but the report of a scientist on a completed experiment. An experiment that, in his opinion, had failed. An experiment that, in his opinion, had failed. But this failed experiment, when dissected for the court, acquired a simple, logical, and absolutely monstrous structure. Motive, method, result. The prosecutor built his indictment on these three pillars, and none of them could be shaken. Motive. It was the most complex and frightening element of this case. This was not greed, not hatred, not revenge. This was pathological intellectual curiosity, the desire to dissect a human emotion like a frog in a biology class. And his main evidence became that laboratory journal found in Leo's room. Every one of its pages screamed of this cold, detached interest. The entry, hypothesis, strong emotional shock, grief can be artificially initiated, was not a line from a teenager's diary, but the title of a scientific paper. For the prosecution, this journal became a window into a mind that perceived human life not as a value, but as a variable in an equation. Method. It was terrifyingly simple and effective, the creation of a deadly trap in complete darkness. And it was confirmed by two independent, yet perfectly complementary sources. The first was Leo himself, his detailed, coherent narrative of how he unscrewed the light bulb, hid it, and went to sleep. The second, and most weighty for the court, was the forensic technician's report. Microscopic fiber traces on the metal base of the socket and blurred fingerprints became the physical echo of his actions. They proved that someone did not simply change a light bulb, but purposefully and carefully unscrewed it, attempting to conceal traces in the process. Confession and expertise met at one point, turning the narrative into irrefutable fact. And finally, the result. It was recorded in the original medical examiner's report and was never disputed. The death of 74-year-old Eleanor due to injuries sustained in a fall from a height. But now, in the light of new data, this was not just a fall. This was a fall that became the direct and inevitable consequence of the method Leo employed. He didn't push her. He didn't hit her. He simply took away the light. And that was enough. Thus, step by step, the prosecution built an iron chain of evidence, where every link was firmly connected to the previous one. Motive from the journal, method from confession and expertise, result from the medical examiner's report. All elements of the case came together into a unified, frightening picture. The prosecution was ready. Now it was the court's turn, which had to decide not only the question of guilt, but also the fate of a boy for whom human life had become only a variable in his monstrous equation. Now it was the court's turn, which had to decide not only the question of guilt, but also the fate of a boy for whom human life had become only a variable in his monstrous equation. The trial, which took place before the juvenile court, lasted several weeks. Behind closed doors, all sides were heard: the grief-stricken parents, making their statements through tears. The detectives methodically presenting the course of the investigation. The forensic technicians explaining the significance of microscopic fibers. And of course, the psychologists who sought to look into Leo's mind. When the judge finally read the verdict, the wording seemed unexpected to many. Found guilty of second-degree manslaughter. For people who had followed this case and seen all the cold calculation and premeditation of the plan, that sounded too lenient. Why not first degree? Why manslaughter? The answer to this question lay not so much in Leo's actions as in his consciousness. A key role in the court's decision was played by the report of the forensic psychiatric examination. Several leading specialists worked with Leo for several weeks, and their conclusion was unambiguous. In the final report, his condition was characterized as personality disorder with pronounced lack of empathy and affective blunting. Simply put, the experts concluded that Leo was fundamentally incapable of experiencing emotions as most people do. He understood the concept of grief intellectually like a mathematical formula, but was organically unable to feel it. From the perspective of Canadian juvenile law, this influenced the classification of his intent. The court found that, although his actions were planned, his primary goal was not the killing as such, but the execution of an experiment. He did not foresee and did not desire death in the sense that a person with a healthy psyche understands it. This legal distinction determined the milder offense. But the sentence, despite the wording, was strict. Leo was placed in a specialized closed facility for juvenile offenders with enhanced psychiatric supervision. There he was to remain under constant control of doctors and psychologists until his 21st birthday. This was not just a prison sentence. This was an attempt by the system not so much to punish as to isolate and possibly understand and correct what was going on in his head. But one question remained unanswered, hanging in the air of the courtroom and in the minds of everyone who knew this story. But one question remained unanswered, hanging in the air of the courtroom and in the minds of everyone who knew this story. After the trial, Leo's parents could not stay in the town where every corner, every familiar sight reminded them of their double, unbearable tragedy. They sold their house and left Silver Creek, disappearing in a desperate attempt to flee a past that will most likely haunt them forever. Eleanor's old farmhouse, once the center of their family universe, now stands empty and abandoned, slowly becoming overgrown with wild grass. For the residents of Silver Creek, this story became a gloomy urban legend, whispered as a warning that the most terrible evil can hide behind the most innocent and loving facade. The Leo case is officially closed. He received his sentence. The system set the legal final point. But that crucial question: what exactly produced such a cold, analytical mind in the body of a 13-year-old boy? Was this pathology congenital, a ticking time bomb from birth, or the result of some indeterminate early trauma? Received no definitive answer from the experts. And in that unspokenness lies perhaps the main horror of this story.